Hi, welcome to the Betsy Giacaruso Studio and Gallery. Today I'm going to be taking you through a set of basic tutorials for the beginner watercolorist. The first one I'll be taking you through is learning how to do your basic washes. Most of the washes that you will need in order to do some basic techniques to create your paintings. So we're going to be setting up a grid sort of like this, and what will be helpful will be to find a mat, or you can use a ruler, but I like to cut a template like this out of a mat board. That way you can just trace some little rectangular spaces, and if you take a quarter sheet of Arches paper, you can do 2 rows of those across the bottom to give yourself plenty of areas to practice your washes in. And I'm going to take you through each of those washes. So, some of the tools that you'll need to get started. Paper, you want to always use 100% cotton rag, even when you're practicing. Cotton rag paper absorbs the paint differently, and so the paint won't sit on the surface. When you're using paper that is made from cellulose or trees and not 100% cotton rag, it's going to tend to sit on the surface and will be more difficult to blend and do some of the important techniques to keep your washes looking fresh. So most of the brushes I use will be a watercolor round, which comes to a point at the end, a flat wash brush. This one happens to be an acrylic. I like it for a little more control, and my flat wash brush has a multi number of different natural hairs as well as a tiny bit of synthetic. Sometimes I'll use a smaller flat brush, and occasionally for more detail I'll use a rigger in my landscapes. But for basic washes, we're just going to use this watercolor round. And we're going to start with just using one color. We're going to use some cobalt blue. You can use ultramarine blue as well, but we're going to stick to one color for starters. You want to squeeze out some fresh paint. You want a nice big large surface area to mix your paints in. And you'll need a tub of water. So we're going to start to create a basic wash. So I'm picking up a certain amount of water and a certain amount of paint. You want it fluid enough. The first wash we're going to do is an even wash. Sometimes you want to be able to cover an area very cleanly and smoothly with that paint. So you'll notice my table is tipped a bit, and that helps. You're going to also use gravity to help you get this wash nice and even. So you're going to start at the top, and you use the point of the brush to pull the paint across, pressing down a little bit so you'll cover a little more area than you would if you're holding it straight up. And you'll see that at the bottom you'll get a bead of paint that accumulates because gravity is pulling it down. Okay, so as you're pulling that bead down with the next stroke, you can do a couple of strokes, but then you're going to want to pick up some more paint. So you want to mix enough so that you don't have to remix on your palette each time. So the more consistent you are with how wet your paint is, the more even your wash will be. When you get to the bottom, you can hold your brush upright a little more to have control, to have a nice even line. So we end up with the bead at the bottom. We're going to rinse our brush and dry it. It's good to have some paper towels under your water so you can control the wetness of the brush. Then I'm just going to pick up some of that excess paint and blot it on the paper towel. And if your wash is wet enough, it should even out. So let's do one more for practice. I'm going to pick up more water and pull it out into this pool of paint that I'm creating. And the other thing that will help your job be more successful on an even wash is to work fairly quickly. If you're trying to be too careful and you take too long, then your strokes are going to be drying before you get back to the next wash. So keep pulling the paint down, and you really want to take the time to play when you're learning watercolor and not worry so much about being perfect. It's not having the most talent always that makes you successful, but it's being persistent and just painting a lot. So you really want to go into painting almost like you're a child, a 5-year-old. Take all the pressure off and tell yourself you're going to play and get into the process. Okay, so we've done a couple of basic washes. Let's pick up a little more of that excess at the bottom here. You can also do this with ultramarine blue. Let's do one more with ultramarine blue. It's a little deeper in color. Some pigments do behave a little differently than others, so it's also good to experiment. Don't worry about the edges being so perfect. Just focus on trying to keep it fluid and create enough of a pile of paint that you don't have to remix and have a different amount of saturation of water in your wash as you're moving down. So if you're seeing brush strokes in your wash, that means you're probably working too dry and not wet enough. So try another and put more water in before you start. Okay, so that's an even wash. So our next wash that I want to tell you about is a graded wash. I like to explain sometimes why or when we might use a particular wash. So a graded wash, I use a lot in the sky when I'm doing landscape. And I like to get the atmospheric feeling of the sky in a landscape. And so it's lighter where you have more influence of the light. And as you go deeper up into the universe, it becomes darker with less influence of light. So there's a couple ways you can do this. I'm going to start by going darker at the top. You're only going to be able to go so dark with cobalt. If you use ultramarine, you'll get a little darker. But the point is to go from dark to light. So I will do a few strokes across. Maybe a third of the way down, I'm going to dip my brush once in the water and just strike it on the side to release some of that water before I go back in, and then do a few more washes across. Dip again and scrape on the side and keep pulling the paint down. And then at the end, I'm going to rinse it off completely, dry it off a bit, and then pull the rest down. So it's a graded wash. So let's try that one more time. And starting at the top, dip and scrape as you move down. Dip and scrape. Dip and scrape. So this one's got a little variation because I'm a little too wet. So you can just keep practicing those. Another way you can do this is just start light and work to dark, which is my favorite way to do a graded wash for a sky and a landscape. So I might take a very pale wash and start at the bottom and work my way up. And gravity will still help me because it's still going to help to dissipate down, the pigment will dissipate down and blend with the stroke before. Now I'm going to pick up a little more paint and put it in with the first lightest wash I created on my palette and bring that in and keep working my way up, do a couple of strokes, take a little more paint, mix it in, make that first light wash even darker, and continue to work up, getting darker each time. And then for the very last, I can pick up a little pure pigment for the last couple strokes. For that graded wash. Okay. Okay, the next wash I want to do is wet on wet. So wet on wet is when you have a wet wash, a whole wash that's still wet, and you move into it with more pigment. So let's just start by creating an even wash. And if you have little bits of the paper showing through, that means you're too dry, because that's called dry brush, when it skims across the slightly rough surface of the paper. And that's a good technique actually to use for sparkles on water, but that's not what we're after here. So now I have this wet wash, and I can go into it with darker paint. And that's called wet on wet. And you can do varying values within it. So the quality of the wet on wet will leave you very soft edges. So what we're going to do next is we're going to do a couple of colors. So a graded wash with one or two colors. So let's start with some yellow. I'm going to use Aurelian, which is a cool transparent yellow. So if I start with the yellow, using the similar technique that I've been, just pulling the paint down, and I can go about halfway down, or let's go 3/4 of the way. And then I'm going to pick up some blue paint and move into it. I'm just going to blend this a little. So midway, they're going to overlap. And you're going to get the blend of colors as a green. Then I'm going to go a little darker and finish that graded wash, still overlapping the yellow until the very bottom. At the very bottom, then I will have some pure blue. So you're moving from yellow to blue with a little bit of pure yellow at the top and finishing with some pure blue at the bottom. So this is a graded wash using two colors. And again, you're going to get the soft edges. So you can practice that using warm tones, cool tones. Let's do one more. And this time, let's use a color triad. I'm going to show you how to use a color triad later in the next tutorial. But we are going to use a color triad for this graded wash, meaning using 3 colors, primaries, a yellow, a red, and a blue. And we're going to let them blend more wet on wet. So again, I'm going to start with the yellow. And I'm going to work my way around the color palette, moving from warm color to cool color. Now I'll use a little bit of permanent rose. Permanent rose is a good basic red to have on your palette because you can make purples and you can also make oranges by mixing it with yellows. And I'm going to overlap this down a little further before I start to bring a little bit of the light wash of blue into it. So you can see how this is a great technique to use if you're doing sunsets. I might start with the lighter colors at the bottom and work my way up. Say if I'm doing a sunset, actually the influence of the sun sometimes will begin with the pink or red. It could be an orange or red as well. So I'm going to start with permanent rose and work my way up. And then come into it with some yellow. Again, going across with my brush, using the side of the brush to press down a little. Beginning to bring a little bit of, just a little bit of blue. And you'll notice in the sky where the yellow moves into the blue, there's always a little bit of a green tinge before it turns all the way blue. So if I wanted to suggest this to be a landscape, I could suggest a landmass in the foreground. Okay, so those are some of the basic washes. I'm going to finish up with one more, and then we're going to talk a little bit about value. One more technique before we move on to value is glazing. Glazing is when you lay a wash of pigment over another wash that's already completely dried. So I'm going to take a little ultramarine and just put a swath right across one of my basic washes, even washes that's dried. So what it does is it gives it a kind of a feeling of stained glass. You have layers, and you can see the layers underneath. And you can do it with different colors. I can do it with the permanent rose. I can do it with the yellow. So when I do it with yellow, I'm going to get a green. And you'll get variations on color. Laying a yellow over a green, for example, or a pink over a blue is going to give you a purple. But that's going to be very different from the purple where you mix both colors together. So mix a little together on your palette and you'll see. So sometimes I would use a glaze if I want to put a cast shadow on the side of a building. I might paint the building with the first lightest wash I see on the building, on the whole thing. And the side that might be in shadow, I could put a glaze on it. After it's dry, I'd come back and lay another layer on top. So you have 2 layers, and that's going to make the value darker and have it appear in shadow. So that's just one of the uses that you might use that technique with. All right, the other thing that I wanted to touch upon are values. Values are really important in painting. They're the structure of a good painting and composition. So practicing paying attention to varying values is really important. If all the values are the same in a painting, that painting's going to be very flat. You could still have a very light painting and still have some variation in value. You could also have a very dark painting, but without a little bit of light and medium value, the dark is not going to have as much power. So learning how to use your values is so important. So let's start with a value grid. You can just separate some little squares on the right of your page. And actually, let's start with the darkest first. So just take some pure paint, and you can adjust these because it's really hard to calibrate from light to dark perfectly without having to make any corrections. So I'm going to shoot to go just a little bit darker or a little bit lighter than my first wash. And these you can adjust. Feel free to come back in wet on wet and adjust these. You can even come back when you get the whole sequence done and adjust by putting a glaze over one of them if it needs to be a little darker. Okay, I'm going to do the third. So you can make 5 rectangles to do your value grid in. 5 or 6 will be fine. Again, using your brush at a little bit of an angle. To press down on the paper and cover a little more space. And again, at the bottom, you can just dry your brush off a bit on the paper towel and pick up any excess paint. And then I'm going to add a little more water, pull out a little paint, and try to adjust a bit lighter. And I always like my students to keep in mind that not to worry about mistakes. There really are no mistakes. It's just about practicing. So don't worry about perfection. When you make mistakes, that's where you're learning. Now, if I wanted, I could do one more that's even lighter. And of course, the last one would be the white of the page, is going to be your lightest value. Okay, so the only other thing that I'd like to mention about basic washes, and just thinking about some of the basics as you're moving into watercolor and trying it out, would be brushwork. So it's a good idea to take some time just to play with your brush and your paints. Take your time. But there are some things that you can do with just brushwork, such as how you use the brush. You can use it on its side like this. If, for example, let me get it a little wetter. It's always nice to have some variation in each stroke. So by using the brush on its side, I create some bolder strokes. And you see the pigment settling at the bottom adds a little variation. Then if I hold my brush straight up using the point more, I can create a suggestion of branches. And I can even create some leaves by using the shape of my brush. So you can play around with some of these techniques and just have a little fun doing it. So it's really just brushwork. If I turn my brush in the other direction, I will have the paint, instead of being darker on the end of the leaf shape, it'll be on the inside of the leaf shape. When you're doing things like leaves and organic things, you'll always want to think about alternating. In nature, everything grows in spirals, including your fingerprints, the hair on your head, the branches on a tree. So always alternate where you're putting your leaves and branches. I can even use the tip of my brush straight up again to connect those leaves to those little branches. Anyway, that's just an example of how you can play with your brushwork, your brush, to create some techniques as well. Okay, so that's an introduction to some basic washes with watercolor. My name's Betsy Giacaruso. And again, thanks for watching. We're here at Betsy Giacaruso Studio and Gallery on 43 East Market Street in the Courtyard in the heart of Rhinebeck.